Hello everybody! In my last video I gave some examples of the hardship Ukraine had and has to endure because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I figured I will make a special standalone video just about this topic. We will have a look at the first decade after the collapse of the Soviet Union and determine how the member states were doing. I will limit myself to Russia, Ukraine and Belarus, both because it keeps the video easier to make and because I have a hard time believing that the average Westerner would truly watch a video that spends a large amount of time on Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan and so on. Of course, once I discuss the short-term consequences of the fall of the USSR, we will also have a look at the long-term changes. That meaning how the countries are doing right now, because a lot changed between 2000 and today. If this sounds interesting or you're interested in history or politics with a focus on leftism, you should probably subscribe, because I upload every week unless mental health incidents occur, and I work with a new fresh topic that usually hasn't been done before. In addition, there will be a creator commentary livestream on my second channel, if mental health permits it, which is linked in the description one day after this upload. Of course, you can donate money and join the Discord server, or you scroll down to the description and click the free 5-person invite links that comes with every video. Yes, you can join for free, you just need to be fast. All that being said, it's time we talk about the video topic. To understand the consequences of the collapse of the USSR, we must first understand the USSR and why it fell. I have 2 videos which explain that, but collectively they're over an hour long, so I will give you a short 5-minute summary in this video. Feel free to skip to the next chapter. The USSR was an attempt at state socialism between 1917 and 1991. It had a federal government system, so every ethnicity would have their own state, and all these states were subservient to one big central government in Moscow. The idea is that Ukrainians should deal with issues in Ukraine, like schools, and the central government would deal with issues that affect the whole union, like defense. This sort of federal system is pretty common in the world. The US, the UK and Germany all have the same government structure. The parliament of the member states and the central parliament were elected by the people, on paper. There was only ever one party on the ballots, and all who stood for election had to be Communist Party members, but technically there was a vote. The Soviet economy was centrally planned. This means that all factories were owned by the state itself, not by capitalists. Sometimes businesses were owned by their workers, but that was very rare. The government would set production goals for these factories using Gosplan, who planned the entire industry of this huge country, and they would financially support less profitable businesses for the sake of providing jobs. The state would also decide how much these factories could sell their products for and who they can sell it to. The entire idea was that the state represents the people, therefore when the state controls everything, the people control everything. And that's what socialism is. Naturally, the control of the state extended to things like press freedoms and secret police. The central government was always very keen to make sure that there would be no movement starting that would endanger the security of the Soviet state. For example, Brezhnev sent in tanks to violently crush the mostly peaceful Prague Spring uprising. But then Gorbachev came and changed it all up. He decided to reform the fuck out of the Soviet state. You need to understand that by this time a lot of people were unhappy. Because of propaganda machines like American television, the Soviet people noticed that they were less prosperous than the ones who lived in a colonialism-fueled West. So Gorbachev went about reforming the USSR away from its socialist goals and towards a capitalist economy. He stopped financial support to state-owned businesses, spiking unemployment. He cut healthcare, reducing life expectancy, and more things that made life worse. Eventually, by 1991, a series of member states had elected pro-independence leaders, and Gorbachev said he would not stop them if they wished to leave. There was an attempt to keep the Soviet Union in a weakened state with larger member states, but a failed Red Army coup made the member states think that the USSR was lost. So in 1991, the prime ministers and presidents of Russia, Belarus and Ukraine met to abolish the USSR. This is significant because it was these 3 states that originally formed the USSR. Seeing this, Gorbachev officially abolished the USSR and the member states were now free. Let's start with Russia. When the Soviet Union collapsed, it was agreed on by the international community that Russia would be the main successor state. So all international treaties that were signed by the USSR and even the UN Security Council seat were all awarded to Russia. And other Soviet republics even gave up their nukes in exchange for guaranteed peace with Russia. For example, Ukraine did that. The man leading Russia in the time we're having a look at is Boris Yeltsin. He was elected president of Russia shortly before the collapse and signed the treaty that dissolved the USSR, so he became the leader of the country. It was a challenge, and nowadays most Russians remember Yeltsin as an alcoholic that fucked up the country. Let's have a look at why. He immediately implemented a plan of shock therapy. This would mean immediately removing the state from most economic functions and reducing state expenditure. In theory, this was supposed to create and stimulate a market, which, as we all know, in theory should work. In praxis, it didn't. As private businesses tried to make a profit, there was hyperinflation. This, along with massive amounts of unemployment, significantly dropped the standards of living. Some economists even say that the drop in standard of living was as bad as the Great Depression was in the USA 6 decades earlier. Many could no longer afford food, which caused hunger and starving, along with supply issues. Interestingly, footage of this hunger period that was caused by establishing capitalism is often used to talk about how bad socialism is, even though it's not socialism's fault that Yeltsin thought that the market could fix anything. The crisis got even worse with Yeltsin's continuing reforms. In Soviet times, about 1.5% of people lived in extreme poverty. Now, half a decade after collapse, it was 50%. According to the World Bank, who is rather neutral on this one specific issue. In 1993, Yeltsin wanted to move forward with his shock therapy, and very basically the parliament and other government organs disagreed. So Yeltsin tried to disband them, and they tried to impeach him, and it all ended with Yeltsin sending tanks to shell the parliament building, and he gave himself the right to remove and replace any government member without parliamentary agreement. I'm not sure this qualifies as the political freedom the Russian people expected to get after the USSR collapsed. Within the decade, the birth rate plummeted by half and the death rate increased. This led to Russia losing 330,000 people over the next years. Matter of fact, the population growth rate was negative until 2012. The life expectancy fell from 64 to 57, and I heard some tankists say that if you add up all of the dropped life expectancy, the collapse of the USSR reaches genocide numbers. Yeltsin also tried and failed to invade Chechnya. Almost oversaw the Red Army nuking the whole world because of a misidentified Norwegian weather missile and the rise of the oligarchs. You see, when Yeltsin privatized everything, he had to give it to people, and in the end, like with any market economy, everything ended up in the hands of really rich people. These oligarchs, and I mean these exact people, still massively influence Russia until today. Eventually, because of his failed economic policies, Yeltsin's approval rating was about 2%, so he resigned in 1999 and was replaced by Vladimir Putin, who you've probably heard about before. Putin and his oligarchs run Russia until today. A lot of statistics like birth rates haven't recovered to this very day. Even the poverty rate is still over 10%, and the unemployment is still 3 times larger than it was in Soviet times. Not surprising that 64% of Russians who lived in the USSR say that their lives were better then. The dream that they had of a world in which they would be as rich as the West remained a dream. They should have engaged in more colonialism, I guess. Life in Russia improved a lot between 2000 and today, which is why many Russians like Putin. He was in charge when stuff got better. Let's carry on with Ukraine. After declaring and gaining independence, the man who signed the accord that dissolved the USSR became ruler of the new independent country. He was the first president and he was never elected. Instead, he was selected by the Ukrainian parliament a few days before the collapse. His greatest feat was removing all nuclear weapons from the country and returning them to Russia. This was done to showcase the new Ukrainian attitude that was towards peace and cooperation, not nuclear threats. He also met with George W. Bush to establish relations with the West. This was naturally an issue because Russia was right there, so amazingly he balanced both sides and was allied with both their former Soviet friends and with the capitalist West. The idea was to make Ukraine cooperate with all its neighbors, not the EU or the CIS, but neutrality and friendship. Naturally, the first president also wanted to establish economic changes. Part of the reason why Ukrainians wanted independence was because they were disillusioned with the centrally planned state socialist economy. So he went about privatizing the whole industry. For this, he made a government organ tasked with giving industry to the people. And it had so little oversight and so much corruption that the economy ended up in the hands of the few. Oops. Then the country experienced large inflation. How large? 10,000% in 1 year. This was not good. Lots of newly private businesses needed money to pay their workers, so they borrowed money from the newly private banks, and the lack of regulation on the market caused a full-on bank crash, causing lots of businesses to die. The worst part of it was that suddenly the government could no longer afford to pay the workers in factories that were not yet privatized. So they just didn't pay people and said that they would pay more once they had the money. This went on for years. The pride of the Ukrainian economy during the Cold War was the Black Sea Shipping Company, the largest shipping company in the world. And the president sold it secretly to foreign capitalists so he could pay some of the debt his country had accumulated because of his reforms. Eventually, in 1994, the people were tired of him and elected a new president. This new president was even more capitalist than the one before him. You see, in the USSR it was custom for the state to subsidize businesses to create jobs, and prices were controlled to prevent inflation. Second president disliked all of this, so he stopped subsidies and price controls. And of course, this spiked the unemployment from 0% all the way up to 15%. Along with that, prices went up and the standards of living plummeted. This had negative effects on the birth rate too. He also, of course, privatized even more businesses, which amplifies issues like unemployment. He did the big brain capitalist idea and reduced taxes, which did not improve the economy, but it did make Ukraine very poor and even more in debt. This president was also accused of being involved in the disappearance of over 2,000 journalists, as well as restricting press freedom. You will not be surprised to hear that he was one of the higher-ups in the Soviet government before Ukrainian independence. But he changed the plans of his predecessor and openly declared that he wanted Ukraine to enter the EU within 2 decades. Of course, nothing came of this so far, but it made the Russians worried. So he turned around and signed the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation and Partnership with Russia. He also engaged in talks with NATO to join the treaty, which never happened, but it caused Ukrainian soldiers to fight in the 2003 invasion of Iraq. He would rule until 2004, and from that point on Ukraine was more Western-oriented, causing tensions with Russia, as well as increasing corruption. In 2014 there was a revolution, and Ukraine has been balancing itself since. The biggest legacy from the Soviet Union in Ukraine is that there are hundreds of thousands of Russians living in what is now Ukraine. They lived here, and the Russian state tried to acquire these regions in 2014 and 2022 respectively. Please note that the second invasion is ongoing as I speak, so in the future I'm sure you will know more. The issue is that the borders of Ukraine were never meant to be national borders dividing ethnicities. They were administrative borders within the USSR, so they did not always make sense from an ethnic or linguistic view. Since the 2000s, the population of Ukraine dropped by 7 million, which is because, yet again, birth rates went down as poverty increased, and the rapid establishment of capitalism significantly reduced the quality and length of life. In Ukraine, 60% of people preferred Soviet times over today. Belarus is a unique former Soviet republic. That's because they held one election in 1994, elected Lukashenko, and he's been ruling ever since. They hold elections, but suspiciously, the president keeps getting more votes, despite more and more people protesting against his rule. Lukashenko has changed the constitution to centralize power around him, and he's accused of having killed political opponents. The country has barely any press freedoms, or individual freedoms for that matter. It's often called Europe's most Stalinist country because it is really dedicated to following the spirit of the Soviet Union with one party and executions by shooting in the back of the head. There are also plenty of human rights violations against political and regular prisoners in Belarus, according to multiple international organizations. Not surprisingly, Belarus is among the worst European nations when it comes to individual and political freedom. Lukashenko has been and continues to be a close ally of Russia. Such a close ally that Belarus allowed Russian troops to go to war against Ukraine on Belarusian territory. Belarus has a strained relationship with the West. Because of a lack of individual freedoms and many other rights violations, this only got worse with the Russian-Ukrainian war. As we already heard before, for the other republics, Belarus has a shrinking population because of economic poverty and low birth rates. The fertility rate is half of what it was in the 90s, and interestingly, Belarus has a large Polish population living near the border. In some regions, 50% of the population are Polish, and in others, 15% are Russians. They even have Ukrainians in the south. As you can tell, Belarus doesn't have a great border. This is because when the border was drawn, it was an internal border in the USSR. With independence from the USSR, Belarus experienced a revival of the Belarusian culture and language. After Lukashenko was almost impeached, then he dissolved the parliament, made a new parliament without his enemies in it. But he did not use the army to shell buildings, so he is still less worse than Yeltsin, I guess. In Belarus, about 50% of people preferred living in the USSR. So yeah, in conclusion, for the first decade after the collapse of the USSR, the former Soviet republics were awful to live in. Unemployment, hyperinflation, as well as massive political corruption and way more. Many indicators like life expectancy have recovered by now, and the former Soviet states are probably about as well off as they were 3 decades ago. But that's after 20 years of recovery. These countries imagined that if they only established market reforms and capitalism, their standards of living would rise to the levels of the West, which never happened. And I think the reason is rather simple. There are only so many resources. Not everyone can have everything. And because of colonialism, it's Europe and America that have everything, not Ukraine and Russia. Thank you for watching. Sorry that I've not uploaded recently. I was in a psych ward because of a suicide attempt. Thank you for understanding, and especially thanks to my patrons, who are Theon Hartley, Potato God 777, Alan Vo, Eric Betts, Harris Hawk, Marcus Aurelia, V, Xander Corbus, Attila Nemetz, Carissa, Comrade Falcon, Daniel Hyman, Dominic Roselli, DSM5 is better than ICD-10, Emily Margot Klassen, Evie Wren, Herdina, Ian Snyder, Josh C, Clastrup, Liam S, Lilith Croft, Mamuka Tsiliari, Marxism Tonight, Nane Pema, Pote, Raymond DeVille, Red Shock Trooper, Sean Murphy, Stairmaster Chef, Theo and Gilliard Jr., and Trey.